Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum here at the Kennedy School of Government. I'm David Elwood, Dean of the Kennedy School, and we're here tonight to mark the 5th anniversary of an event that dramatically changed the history, certainly in the United States and around the world. Obviously, on September 11th, 2001, terrorists made an unprecedented imprint on the very fabric of both the nation and changed the course of history here, I think, forever. It was certainly a day fraught with evils. It was a day fraught of terrorism and vengeance. And at the same time, it was a moment when humanity was revealed at its finest. And there were heroes, emergency workers, and everyday citizens, and everyone else. Our former President Summers used to be fond of saying, remember on that day that it was government workers who were running up the staircases of 9/11. And so service and heroism was very much a part and at the center of things. So it's the stories of all this bravery and the remarkable images of people who perished that I think will stay with us forever. But I also think with 5 years reflection, it's a time not only to commemorate, but to think about where we stand, where we go from here, how we might move on, and continue how long the war on terror will continue. And tonight we're joined by some extraordinary people, each of whom has a different and most valuable perspective. It's my job simply to introduce the first of those speakers, our moderator, the University Distinguished Professor and Sultan of Oman Professor of International Relations, Joseph Nye. Now, Professor Nye received his bachelor's degree summa cum laude from Princeton. He did postgraduate work at Oxford University, he was on Rhodes, and he got his PhD here at Harvard. He, quite importantly, was the dean here at the Kennedy School from 1995 to summer 2004. And indeed, it was under his deanship that this horrendous event occurred. On that day, there was a spontaneous forum that gathered here up on this stage that Dean Nye left, and it was one of the most memorable events of many, many years. And so now, Dean Nye, who has served as a Deputy Undersecretary for Security Assistance, Science and Technology, he's chaired the National Security Council Group on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, had chaired the National Intelligence Council, and so forth, is back. He's the author of books that talk about soft power and talk about our future of security. So it is to him that I turn over this stage at this, on this most memorable of dates to think about where we are and where we're headed. Joseph Nye.
Thank you very much, David. It's quite striking to be back in this forum on September 11th, because I think any of us who were here at that time will remember that forum that we held. It had been such a beautiful day, the clear sunshine, much like today, and the shock of what we discovered, of a world falling around us, really brought a lot of questions to everyone's mind. Some people suggested, well, maybe we should call off classes and let people go home. And instead, we thought, no, what is it we do here? And what we do here, first of all, is create a community. And the other is to try to understand the world and find out if we can make sense of what's happening. And this forum was jammed with all sorts of people, and everyone not knowing the answers, but intensely interested in the questions. And I think it was a tribute to the Kennedy School community that we were able, at that terrible moment, to at least try to begin the process of understanding. And that process of understanding is what we're trying to continue tonight. It's not necessarily to cast blame or to say that we have the answers, but to try to advance the ideas of where are we, or in the words of a famous painting by Degas, who are we, where did we come from, where are we going? And I think those are the types of questions we want to look at tonight. We have a quite remarkable group of people to help us launch that discussion before we turn it over to you. To my immediate left is Baroness Kishore Faulkner, who's an IOP Fellow this fall. Was appointed to the House of Lords in 2004 and was the first Muslim to be promoted to the front bench in UK parliamentary history. She's a member of Prime Minister Blair's task force on Muslim extremism and has also worked in Parliament on human rights, European Union, foreign affairs, development, defense, and legal services. To her left is Juliet Kayyem, a lecturer on public policy here in the school, who from '99 to 2001 served as a member of the National Commission on Terrorism. She's been an advisor to Attorney General Janet Reno and recently co-authored with Phil Hyman, Preserving Liberty in an Age of Terror. To Juliet's left, General Tad Ulstrom, a lecturer in public policy and director of our national security program here at the school. Tad served for 35 years in the Air Force, retiring as a lieutenant general with a number of important commands, fighter wings in England, Southwest Asia, Germany, and the U.S. Air Force Academy. Samantha Power, to Tad's left, is the Lind Professor of Practice of Global Leadership and Public Policy, a beloved member of the faculty who was absent for a year on leave, but we now are going to make her work as she comes back. She's author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, and was the founding executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. So we have people who are going to have different views and different takes, but committed to try to advance understanding. As we try to understand what's happened 5 years after 9/11, I think one of the most important things is to realize that the clash that we're seeing is not a clash of civilizations. And that is important because there's nothing that Osama bin Laden and his colleagues would like more than for us to turn it into a clash of civilizations. It's sometimes said that terrorism, that the politics of terrorism is like the game or sport of jiu-jitsu. The smaller opponent has to use the larger opponent's strength to defeat the larger opponent. That extent, if bin Laden is able to get us to turn this into a clash of civilization, he wins. Because we cannot win unless the mainstream of Islam wins. And as I see it, in my interpretation, what we have is not a clash of civilizations, but a civil war within Islam between a small minority who are trying to use force to impose their extreme ideological view of their religion upon a much larger mainstream of believers who have a variety of views, but those views do not include killing women and children and other innocents. And in that sense, it's essential for us then to realize that as we deal with this issue, we have to use what I've called soft power as well as hard power. We needed to use hard power to destroy the Taliban government that had provided sanctuary to al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. But frankly, we're not going to win unless we use soft power to win the hearts and minds of the mainstream and prevent them from being recruited by the extremists. And in that sense, I think it's important that as we deal with this issue, we have to realize that this war, if we call it a war on terrorism, is not like a war in which it's just the larger army that wins. It's the side with the better story that wins. So as we try to understand this struggle that we're facing, keeping in mind that it is not the predicted clash of civilizations unless we make it one, seems to me the first step of wisdom. And that is important for the Kennedy School, which, as we all know, is a school with students from nearly 100 nations. So with those brief introductory remarks, let me try to ask our panelists a few questions. But let me start with one to which I'll solicit a brief answer rather than a long, thoughtful answer, which is, are we safer today or less safe than we were 5 years ago? Maybe I'll just go right down the line. Kishore?
Thank you, Professor Knight. First, could I just say how honoured I am that you have a Brit, someone who's speaking from a slightly different perspective on things, and I'm very honoured to be here. I think the answer is, in essence, that we are safer, yes, but we're also slightly less safer. And we're safer because we have better intelligence, better security. We are more vigilant. We're less safe because some of our actions abroad, American and British actions abroad, that's how I say we, have led to more people not being on our side.
Juliet?
Thanks, Joe. Thank you. And also, I was on a train to New York on September 11th and did not make that forum here, but I do have to say that today is a very emotional day for a lot of people, and I'm glad that so many students came out to help us put into perspective something that happened to a lot of you, I would guess, were in college at the time. So just to reiterate, I think yes, but I would put it a different way, slightly different way. Yes, but we could have been safer. I mean, in other words, we are safer clearly, just in particular because of the war in Afghanistan, which clearly disrupted Al-Qaeda, which they didn't seem to have a plan B. In other words, they did not assume that our actions would be so quick. They thought we would get stuck in Afghanistan for a long time, and it was just an incredibly successful war. We can talk later about what's happening there now. But clearly what happened in 2003 with the war in Iraq sort of changed it, and so we are definitely safer against the specific threat that we face, but what we don't know is the extent to which, what I would say, we sort of raised the temperature in a world that I think was sort of looking for us not to do so in 2003.
Ted?
Safer, but not safe. And I think we've heard that comment so many times. Safer because we know so much more about the threat. On September 11th of 2001, we didn't know much about the international aspects of the threat. And when we look back at what we didn't know then and what we do know now, in some ways we're much more uncomfortable, but we are safer. And I think it's based on that we need to go forward. I don't know if we're 10% down the road or 50% down the road, but we're a long ways from 100%.
Samantha?
I just expected that we were all going to agree at how much less safe we were than we were on 9/11. So it's amazing. I think, that actually one of the few truly sensible things that Don Rumsfeld has said in the last 4 years is that the essential question is, are we neutralizing or destroying more terrorists than we are creating? And the blunt instrument of military power has generated such a degree of hatred that not only are people lining up in droves to undertake terrorist attacks against, if not Americans here, because they may not be able to get in, but American interests, American allies, American personnel abroad. And indeed, if America's long-term stability rests on the cultivation of stable or more democratic regimes, if not stable democratic regimes, in places where there is strong, lethal anti-American sentiment, then the fact that moderates of the kind, Joe, you were mentioning at the start, have been so marginalized by their association with American rhetoric and American policy seems to me also, in the medium to long term, very, very dangerous for U.S. interests.
Yeah, there is an argument one could make to make the other side, which is that we may have disrupted Al-Qaeda, but what's happened is that Al-Qaeda has metastasized. It's no longer the central organization, but there are now many more people out to kill us than there were on 9/11 5 years ago, which makes the answer to the question a little bit harder. But let me ask Kishore about the situation in Britain. One of the great shocks, obviously, was the bombing in London. And there's been a theory, which is that the root cause of the current terrorism, the jihadist extremist terrorism, has been the absence of democracy in the Middle East. And yet the bombings in London were carried out by mostly second-generation Muslims who had grown up in a democracy. What does that tell us about this question about whether democracy is the cure for the roots of this?
I think we need to be clear in terms of what we mean by democracy in the Middle East. If you had, my hunch is that if you had free and open and fair elections tomorrow, for example, in Egypt, you would get the Muslim Brotherhood in power by the droves, and they would be an authoritarian government. There's no question about that. So they wouldn't be a democratic government in any sense that we know it. I don't think democracy is the issue in terms of terrorism, or the lack of democracy in terrorism. I think what happens in terms of Al-Qaeda's terrorism has metastasized and affects young Muslims, and Islam's quest for justice. Justice is a very strong and compelling attribute within Muslim societies, and you get extremism among young people. There are lots of different reasons for that. I don't think democracies, what we saw in Britain with those young men, subsequently when we saw the videotapes whereby they said that it was Britain's foreign policy and justice for the Palestinian brothers that they were seeking, was, I think, pretty cynical manipulation by Al-Qaeda of young people who fell for that.
Let me turn to the American scene and ask Juliet, what has been the effect on liberties in America, including the liberties of Muslims? You're an expert on this, and we also know that in American history, there have been periods such as the Civil War or beginning of World War II, when figures like Lincoln and Roosevelt have severely invaded American civil liberties. How do we compare today with our own history, and how would you judge the effects of 9/11 on the separation of powers in the United States and in civil liberties?
There's a couple questions here. Let me start with, if the internment of Japanese Americans is our standard, we're doing much better. But this is a different, as we know in the war paradigm, is difficult to push, but this is different in terms of the constitutional structure, and it's different for three important reasons in our democracy. And it's an issue that, despite appearances or despite what you hear in the media, actually has not really ever been addressed by our Supreme Court. So what's different about it? The first is that this war is basically going to be fought on intelligence and law enforcement ground from now on. There's a military part, but when you actually look at the future of the kind of threat we have, it's going to be intelligence/interrogations, law enforcement /surveillance, right? So those are the biggies right now, the torture debates and the NSA debates. That is a very different debate than sort of the laws of war, so to speak, in terms of how the military would sort of go into the battlefield. And it's going to affect U.S. citizens in ways that they never thought it would affect them. So that's what's different about where we are. The second is, unlike in World War II, and Samantha certainly knows a lot more about this than me, but we've had 60 or 70 years of progressive human rights activity in response to what happened in World War II, which was codified by our Congress. In other words, the successes of us legislating the Geneva Conventions and other things, which make which mean that the president is not acting alone, right? There is a series of laws that might regulate this. And the third is because a lot of this does affect U.S. citizens, whether it's profiling or surveillance, in particular the NSA debates that we're seeing. Congress believes, and Congress has very detailed legislation on a lot of this activity. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the thing that everyone has been reading about. And so that's why we're coming to a different kind of clash than we saw even with Lincoln, who did a lot of things that asserted his commander-in-chief authority, but then when Congress came back, because they weren't always in session, got legislative authority. The internments by which Roosevelt, with the help of, the famous liberal Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was governor of California at the time, got legislation to support the internments. Here we have the constitutional question, I think, that the Supreme Court has not addressed, and the one that makes Bush's actions unique, I think somewhat dangerous, and are not consistent. You know, we hear a lot of times, well, all presidents push their authority. What's actually not true in this case is this: the president is arguing now that his commander-in-chief authority permits him to, and I'll use a word, supersede or replace a legislative background. The Supreme Court this summer, when it addressed this issue in the detention cases, the Hamdan decision that a lot of you may have followed in the military commissions, really, the truth is, they punted that issue. And so the constitutional question that we're facing, and one that you have to remember, whatever your politics are, is going to survive President Bush, whether it's McCain, Clinton, or whoever else, is whether we believe in a constitutional society. I certainly don't, that a president can actually trump, replace, supersede, violate, whatever, a legislative statute. And I think it's important to put it in historical perspective, because this is the president's assertion of authority in the last 5 years is actually different, and one that if allowed to go forward without congressional legislation or without the Supreme Court having to speak again on it, is actually, I think, one that will have sort of a tremendous impact on what we think the commander-in-chief ought to be able to do in a war, whatever it looks like in the future.
Ed, why do you think we haven't had an attack? Many people sitting in this room 5 years ago would have expected another attack by now. What do you think would be a reason why we haven't seen it? We've seen lots of attacks around the world, but not a major attack inside the United States.
To start with, I think we have impacted the infrastructure of the al-Qaeda that we saw at 9/11. We have fractured it in many different ways, and not just militarily. I think we've also provided a positive approach from a mental sense of being able to understand and, if you would, stiff-arm some of those al-Qaeda attempts. And that's been apparent throughout the world as we have seen a number of terrorist attempts derailed. That's a very positive part of our answer or response to 9/11. I think there has been certainly a relationship to the military and the actions that it has taken in both Iraq and Afghanistan to break down the al-Qaeda presence at that location. Realizing, of course, that I agree that we now have terrorist cells literally around the world, but is that because of what's happening in Afghanistan or Iraq, or is that because our information, our awareness, and society's willingness to point out these type of terrorist cells has been improved significantly? So it becomes more of a combination of all of these things. I don't think the intent has been decreased. If anything, the intent from terrorist cells has probably been increased in terms of doing what they're trying to do. One other factor in my mind is that 9/11 changed the threshold, and the threshold is very high right now, and that a terrorist attempt has got to be geared towards raising the threshold one more notch, and that to kill 30 or 40 or a lower level attempt is not going to meet the mark. So the attempt is always going to be to raise that threshold, and it's more and more difficult for them to meet that threshold.
Samantha, what do you see broadening this beyond just the immediate question of terrorism? What do you see as the effects of 9/11 on what you might call the rest of our policy? We've talked about our effect on civil liberties at home, but what about our foreign policy? What's been the effect? How have things changed over 5 years because of 9/11?
Well, just to take a couple of the things that I guess the most often about humanitarian intervention as one evolving norm that in the 90s was oft debated, very controversial, of course. But what you had in the wake of Rwanda, as you know, is the shadow of Rwanda hanging over policy debates, even debates about development aid and assistance. You could feel Rwanda and the guilt over Rwanda. The debate over HIV/AIDS and antiretrovirals, a lot of what was being played out in policy circles was displaced guilt about what had gone on in Rwanda and a chance to save people who were still alive. The shadow of Rwanda has, of course, been replaced across the board, not just in the United States, but across the world, by the shadow of Iraq. And to a large degree, all that does is thickens the alibi that countries who really aren't terribly predisposed to risking either money or troops or police to stabilize countries that don't matter to the national interest as such. This just gives them, in a way, something to point to. Military power, when tested, I defer to the general here, but is often a much less daunting sort of enterprise than the threat of military power. And for those of you who have watched the events in Darfur just over the last couple of weeks even, it's just astounding to see the degree to which the Sudanese are not only spitting on the United States and not only spitting on Britain, who's taken actually the again behind the United States in trying to urge a UN deployment there, but also at the African Union, just an impunity that bad guys are going to enjoy now, both because the United States is overstretched, and the U.S. never was a part of, or was rarely a part of actually getting involved in these kinds of things on the ground, but diplomatically it had profound summoning power. It had money, it had carrots, and it had sticks. Now, if power is rooted not just in hard power, Joe, as you've long shown, but also in America's, or rather in the world's perception that we use our power properly, so legitimacy, but also that we use it competently. And so if power is in fact not about power, but about influence, US influence is so eroded, and crucially, and I do want to stress this point, no one else has stepped up on the international stage to take ownership of some of these humanitarian questions. If I could just touch on one other thing, and that is the norms that have been at the centerpiece, at least of American rhetoric over the generations, democratization and freedom and human rights, although Republicans don't like the language of human rights that much because, or at least people who don't like multilateral institutions, because human rights are seen to sort of implicate, international law and so on. But freedom and liberty and all of these things that they do like talking about, that rhetoric, again, because of this void internationally and because no European countries or no anchor states that one might think would step up, like South Africa or potentially Nigeria, Japan, one goes groping, right? Turkey, Jordan, but countries that might have more legitimacy in the developing world, concepts like democracy are equated these days in people's minds. Not that people, people want to choose, or they want human security, they want physical security, they want economic security, but the language of democracy is associated with regime change or with electocracy, and the idea that you just show up on election day, and then if you don't like the results, you move on to a different country. And so we need kind of norm rehabilitation, as well as other actors who might have more legitimacy and credibility in speaking out on some of these questions to inject themselves into the global debate, and they haven't done that.
Tad, following Samantha's comment about American hard power, what has happened to American military in the last 5 years?
There certainly has been a number of folks that have said that our American military is broken or it is breaking. My answer to that question is it's not, and it won't. The American military, I would not say it's stronger relative to the task that has been asked to do. There's a great reality that there has to be significant changes and transformation of our military to take on the missions that it's now been asked to do. And therein lies the difference. We have not yet completed that transformation, and I don't know when we will, but the fact is the military has stood up to its need to be able to operate in a stabilization environment where it is still very close to a hot war. The problem is that we haven't been able to complete the training that's required or the transformation, if you would, of individuals that can fill the roles on the streets of Baghdad or the streets of Fallujah. But we are taking very positive steps along those lines, but it's going to take a significant amount of effort. And it's also going to take some crucial decisions on how to balance our conventional powers in terms of sheer force with the powers that we're asked to provide in a place like stabilization in Afghanistan or Iraq.
Kishore, as you look at the situation today from the perspective of London or for Britain, what are your expectations about the future? Is this something where you see the bombing in London or the airline plot as the sort of the crest of the wave? It's now broken? Or do you expect this to keep on for a long time? How does it look from your perspective, and what can be done to shorten it?
Well, you know, it's in Britain we tend to be pragmatic. We also tend to be phlegmatic, and we've had a very long history of knowing terrorism, seeing terrorism right up front on the street next door, because the IRA didn't confine its terrorist activities to Northern Ireland. It brought them to us in London into Parliament. One of Margaret Thatcher's former cabinet ministers and close friend was murdered in a car park in the 1980s. So we, I think, realize that we're probably in it for the long run. And, you know, Britain is a relatively small country, 16 million people. Over the course of only 30 years of IRA terrorism, 3,600 people died in a country of that size. So there is a sort of wariness about it. But I think what some of the current difficulties that Prime Minister Blair is experiencing come from some of the things that Samantha was talking about. And indeed, President Khatami yesterday brought it up. You get to a point, I think, in terms of wariness of politicians by the electorate, when double standards are applied so frequently that you end up in a world without standards. And I think people in Britain are very attuned to foreign policy. There's a great deal of interest in British foreign policy. There always is, because, you know, the legacy of empire, there was always bound to be. But one of the things that very ordinary people, I'm not talking here about a Muslim Britain, I'm talking about mainstream Britain, where what has happened in terms of the promises to negotiate some kind of settled peace in the Middle East, to deal with the India-Pakistan problem, and all the other problems in terms of human rights. Darfur is nearer to us in Europe, and we're seized by it. It's in our papers all the time. People are so angry at Blair's lack of delivery for having become the president's poodle, and that's what we call him in Britain. People are so, and I think part of his 16 months into a pretty good election victory, the reason that he finds himself as beleaguered as he does now is because people are wary of double standards. Insofar as the terrorism, we will live with it. I think we're in it for the long haul. That's my personal opinion. I think there's deep disappointment that it is homegrown to some extent, that there are people who are, as you said, second-generation Muslims, who feel so alienated from their own country and feel so little loyalty towards it, that they're prepared to go out and do that sort of stuff. But I think looking at that from that perspective, it's going to be a generation before we turn things around.
That's an interesting thought, and I want to get Juliet's comment on it, because if terrorism comes in generational waves, I mean, the anarchists, the beginning of the 20th century, the various red brigades of the 60s, 70s, these things tend to take a generation to burn out. Then we have a long way to go. We're only 5 years into this, and if that's the case, if the generational theory that Kishore mentioned is correct, what's that going to do to our civil liberties? In other words, what will it do to our society? 5 years, as you said, we've got some problems, but we're not doing as badly as we might. But if people are correct when they call this the long war, what happens to our democracy when you have wartime conditions for a very long time?
Well, I don't buy into the notion of the war, so I just want to challenge you on. The war is over. If you didn't get the memo, it is over because you're exactly right that it is generational, and you can't conceive, at least in a constitutional democracy, we can conceive of it in Burma, but not here, that the commander-in-chief authority that is evoked in wartime, that we would all, I think, want to give our president in wartime, would last indefinitely. World War II, a threat, however bad September 11th was, a threat that was an existential threat to the notion that there would be democratic societies in Europe, and that Europe and the rest of the world would be run by, totalitarian, genocidal maniacs. So it's over, and there will be a military part to it, but there's going to be law enforcement, intelligence, diplomatic, international norms aspects to it. It will regularize itself. The war analogy, I think, now is used, unfortunately, for political purposes. And if you can reconceptualize what it is that we're threatening, I believe it could be very violent, but I don't believe it's an existential threat to the United States, as, say, the Civil War was. What we need to do as citizens, as students, is accept that we will live with a certain amount of risk, and that's life, unfortunately. And it's a risk that we face every day when we decide to do certain things, and it's a risk that we might suffer from outside elements that hate us. But there will always be a certain amount of risk. So the answer from the separation of powers notion is then how do we institutionalize or regularize that level of risk. And so I do believe, for example, that our president ought to have more authorities in certain aspects of the effort against terrorism. And so we should, like we normally do, pass laws to do that. But I also believe that I tell a lot of my students that law is often not the problem, and guess what? The lawyers are often not the solution. That a lot of the changes that need to occur in the United States response to terrorism are not because of the boogeyman of the Fourth Amendment or our PC-ness about racial profiling. They are about bureaucracies that still don't work, and a director of national intelligence who doesn't actually have a lot of authority, and that's where the fight is. And this is doable, is basically the deep breath I also want to take, that we have suffered tremendous threats in the past. We've made mistakes, no doubt, but we also ought to learn from them too.
Ted?
Let me just challenge you a little bit, Juliet, on this. War is over. I mean, if we talk to the thousands, hundreds of thousands of our military who are consumed with training for, deploying in, taking casualties, not at a great number, but casualties that certainly make our press. How would you characterize this action if it's not war, and where do we get the support from the American people by calling it something else?
So there's three wars. There's clearly a war in Afghanistan. There's clearly a war in Iraq. And then there's the war on terrorism that we were talking about. And they are distinct, right? There are different aspects. The military is being used in different ways for all three. So that's one thing. So that obviously there are hot wars, as they say, or in the legal parlance, there are zones of active combat in which the military does what it needs to do in those zones. But if you talk about a war on terrorism, then you are talking about an endless, not geographically there's no space or place or limit on it. And that's where I think that's where it gets kind of scary for the future. To galvanize the troops, I mean, so to speak, the public, imagine if after September 11th, we simply just didn't call it a war on terrorism, that there would be a war in Afghanistan, and there would be a threat called Al-Qaeda that we would get in a variety of ways, not just military. I think you would have gotten a tremendous support from the American public. I mean, you can't name a soul who would have I mean, I guess you can name some souls, but people tended to support the war in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, I think the war analogy has not only sort of justified different wars that may not be related to why you're all sitting here today, but it's also justified a conception of presidential / vice presidential power that simply ought not to survive 5 years later. I could understand it in the fall of 2001, but 5 years later.
My problem is being able to back
Yeah.
up and start over with the way we describe these things, and I certainly agree with you along those lines.
Well, how we go forward, Samantha, it's interesting to think back 5 years to September 12th. Everybody was flying a flag. The sense of community was extremely strong. And it wasn't just in the United States. In Tehran, people were lighting candles in sympathy with New York. Somebody like Lala in Beirut was condemning the attack on 9/11. And today, we're very, very far from that. However we got there is less of a question than how do we get out of there. So what's your crystal ball of how we win these hearts and minds?
I like their questions better. No. Well, first of all, you know, we were all talking about where we were on 9/11 and you know, just the effect, and everyone has a story and a reaction. And I remember I was trying to finish A Problem from Hell, this book on American responses to genocide, and of course, you know, couldn't work for quite a while. But I remember thinking, gosh, you know, this could so go either way. You know, we could in this moment develop this, having not been scarred by war on shore in our nation's history, apart from the Civil War, the war of our own making. But even Pearl Harbor, you know, was offshore, and maybe, just maybe, you know, this will attune us or give us tentacles that we have lacked, that maybe people in Europe, you know, who are not only seasoned to dealing with terrorism but have dealt with war, but maybe somehow this will sharpen our powers of empathy. So when we see other people suffering, other people dying, you know, we'll have a sense of what that means for families to be ripped apart, and just sort of, you know, our empathy gene would somehow get mobilized by this experience. And then, of course, the other way it could have gone is that it's not about human beings and empathy as such. It's about us, and it's about fear. And I'm writing this book now about Sergio Vieira de Mello, who was the best the UN ever produced, and he was blown up in Iraq in August 2003. And actually, what people forget, but was the first ever suicide bomb in Iraq, as bad as we remember it always having been there from the moment that the war started. In fact, there was a brief grace period, and he was the victim of the first suicide bomb. But he used to say, one of his last speeches, in fact, was him talking about fear, and the title of the speech was, "Fear makes a bad advisor." You know, fear is a bad advisor. And I guess, I feel like until we both look out for ourselves, which we didn't do adequately, we didn't have the imagination to run with these guys who were getting more and more sophisticated and implanting themselves in more diverse ways. Now we have the imagination, but we seem to still be in the same place as being unable to imagine anybody else's pain or anybody else's deprivation, and thus ultimately unable to get at the root of what's coming at us. Because there's going to be some number of people who want to kill us at all times and always have, even if just out of resentment, you know, at the rich guy or the powerful guy. I think the only curable question from the standpoint of us in a public policy realm is, how do we get at all those people who used to root against those people, just what you're saying on 9/11 and before, and are now rooting for or joining those who want to come after us. And if I could just say one other thing, I think you know, what's totally absent, I think Juliet was getting at this really importantly, but what is so absent in this country, you know, by the president so far, maybe tonight will be different, but is the adult conversation, you know, the reckoning, the leveling. You know, of course, there's now been, you know, the polls have said, acknowledge you did something wrong, you might have made a few mistakes here and there, but there's been no meaningful reckoning, and there's no meaningful accountability with you know, and it would be true if Democrats were in power too, I'm sure, but with one party in control of the Congress and the executive branch and increasingly the courts. But the problem with this lack of an adult conversation is that we're all, not we're all, but a majority of people are about to throw baby out with bathwater and say basically, and you see this in Europe especially, you certainly see it in the developing world, but you even see it among centrist, let's say Democratic voters maybe, certainly among progressives in this country, but a tendency to say, just because George Bush hyped the threat, there is no threat, you know? And that comes from the fact that we haven't, speaking of norm rehabilitation, we haven't recalibrated our words. We haven't actually had the adult conversation about the kinds of sacrifices that are going to be need to be made in the long haul. It's not just about giving up toothpaste. It's about really investing in the societies, you know, within international institutions, giving up a little bit of sovereignty here and there as a way of entering a global conversation, a global commitment to stability. And that's not a conversation anybody in this administration has been prepared to have, and most Democrats are reluctant to have it too, because they look at the polls and they say, oh, that won't go down well in the swing states. Well, guess what? You know, the swing states won't go down well in history if we don't start talking straight.
We're now at the point in our program where it's over to you in the audience. You will find that there are 2 microphones here on the floor and 2 in the balconies. And I'd invite you to line up behind a microphone if you'd like to ask a question. I'd also remind you that a question is short. It ends with a question mark, and they come 1 per customer. With that, let's start here.
Good evening, Lawrence Walmsley, second-year MPA. Going back to the question of why 5 years on there hasn't been another attack, I think in contrast to a big spectacular attack, the more powerful attack is the small attack, the mall that gets blown up or shot up. And given how easy it is to get guns here, why hasn't that happened? Why hasn't someone who's disaffected gone to a mall, gone to Walmart, picked up a rifle, shot up some people? And I think it has something to do with the fact that Muslims here are not radicalized. And so the real question, I guess, is why hasn't that happened as opposed to London or Europe?
All right, why hasn't there been, since it's so easy to do a suicide bombing by walking into a mall, and it hasn't happened. Juliet, you want to try that?
Well, I mean, the theories are diverse, ranging from, I mean, there's just a number of theories, and anyone who says that they know is not telling the truth. There are a number of theories out there. One is the, you know, well, they're on their time, not on our time, so they might still be planning something. Another is that the threat in the war in Afghanistan really did disrupt them in serious, meaningful ways, that it's hard for them to plan the spectacular attack, and that the European attacks and what's going on in Iraq are sort of phase 2. You know, there's the, you know, sort of the way we've waged the war here and with Homeland Security have been more successful than we give them credit, than many people give them credit for. And I will say there might be something to that. I mean, the story a couple weeks ago where I think like 17 Egyptian guys went missing all of a sudden. Do everyone remember this over the summer? And everyone was like, how could that happen? I mean, the truth is, it's actually a good news story. People came in, told us they were going to Wyoming or Montana. They didn't show up. And within 24 hours, I think it shows that our borders are probably much more vigilant than we give them credit for. And then there's the immigrant story of Lebanese Americans and Arab Americans in this country. It's just very different than it is in Europe. They've been more successful. They've been here longer for the most part. Their sense of assimilation has been different. I will just say this as a fact that they're majority Christian of the Arab community than Muslim in America, so that you have just a split within the population, and that actually most Muslims in America are from African descent. So the geography and the politics of this sort of get played out differently. But just one thing, that question is both, you know, it's a good news question, but it's also an unhelpful question in many ways, because one, it's only true until the next attack, and then all of a sudden we wonder what happened. But also I just, you know, if you do imagine 5 years after World War II, what was this nation like? We had, you know, successfully eviscerated totalitarian states. We were invested in bringing countries back from the brink. The civil rights, because of the military movement, had started in this country. Middle class had begun, and there was home ownership. And the fact that we hadn't been attacked in the 5 years after Pearl Harbor was not the reason why people necessarily felt optimistic. I mean, I think that there was another feeling out there about where the country was heading. So I think actually the polling that that the administration or that even this nation may be heading in the wrong direction is actually consistent, or not, I would put it a different way, not inconsistent with the fact that we haven't been attacked, that there's other barometers for that question.
Yes, Dalphne.
Yes, my name's Alan Kant. I'm a local resident. The question is, if the Iraq war has created more extremists and more terrorists, how can we de-escalate the war and have peace talks towards a softer approach and towards more congeniality?
Ted, you want to try that?
I think Joe ought to take that one on, since
I'm just a moderate moderator.
he's had that answer all the way along. There is no good answer. I would start with that. I am a believer that we must stick it out in Iraq. We must stick it out in Afghanistan at some level. We must continue to find ways that we can provide stability, realizing that we are going to continue over time changing the approach. As we find one approach not working, we're going to have to keep changing approaches. I don't see any drastic changes in force levels immediately. I can see a reduction in force levels as we can confirm that Iraqi police forces and Iraqi military are capable of establishing security in particular areas. But this is not an easy process. It's a one step at a time. It's a 1 month or 2 month segment at a time where you can maybe make a step back and take a look at it. But if anybody has the good answer, I hope they write it down and write an editorial, because I have not seen the perfect answer.
The other balcony.
Yes, my name's Michael Yogman. I'm a pediatrician here in Cambridge. And my question concerns the interview that John Yoo gave to NPR last week about essentially justifying the concept of a hard war and all the ramifications that have been central to the current administration's policy against terrorism. But ultimately, when pushed, said that it was ultimately a political question for the electorate to decide. My question is, what have been the costs to American safety from a future attack of a unilateral focus on a hard war by this administration? And why has it been so difficult for the media to convey some of the complexity of those issues to the American electorate?
Who would like to? Samantha, you want to try that?
Was it just,
Well, what has been the effect on our safety of the focus on a hard military approach, and how has that
well,
increased or decreased our safety?
you know, the only obvious victories, I guess, that one can point to are the success stories in the, what do we call it, Juliet, if it's not a war on terrorism? I'm a sucker. What do we say?
Struggle
It's a
against
terrorist
terrorism.
threat. It's the terrorist threat.
The struggle against terrorism. I've just
Combating the
completely
terrorist threat, right.
duped.
Get it out of the, yeah.
like so many of my countrymen. But the successes that we point to, whether it's the foiling of a plot or the foiling of a non-plot, you know, presumably you're going to have X number of false positives before you have, are actually foiling genuine plot. Our intelligence successes, the few glimmers of success that have been dined out upon by this administration in Iraq are successes. They don't mention this in the small print, but the UN are those who came in and actually, it was Lakhdar Brahimi, Sergio Varadamella's successor, who came in and helped designate the successor government to the governing council, and then, much more crucially, put the elections in place throughout Iraq. It turns out that that's not experience or expertise that actually vests yet, anyway, nor need it within this government, or actually within any government, how to do an election. And the UN had done, 20 of them or whatever over the previous decade. And what's so unfortunate is that instead of, again, talking about this toolbox that one is going to need to employ, in getting at this hydra and this ever-changing hydra with all these copycat movements of different shapes and forms and places, instead of crediting law enforcement, intelligence, ultimately multilateral institutions, not out of some ideological affection or, or sort of lily-livered devotion to internationalism, but simply for pragmatic reasons, that it turns out the threats that we're facing will only be combated transnationally, and in all likelihood, however hard the US military works to get better at doing the hearts and minds part of nation building and counterinsurgency, the US military is ultimately being asked to perform tasks that we need other actors to be performing, specifically, of course, local actors, but also people who aren't just doing it on the fly. I mean, counterinsurgency is different, but asking soldiers to perform civilian tasks gets us out of the tougher task of actually getting civilians in place who bring the kind of expertise that we need in these transitional societies. So the point is simply that there are a lot of reasons not to go unilateral, and they're not simply out of just, sort of regard for international law. It's because that's actually, it's the multilateral approach that has been more successful in these 5 years.
Good evening. I'm Raul Prabhakar, a sophomore at Harvard College. And a little while ago, President Clinton said that the American people prefer someone who is strong and wrong on foreign policy rather than someone who is weak and right. And I mean, thinking about that, many, if not most people in the country have said that the Bush administration's foreign policy is not working. How come we haven't seen a clear, articulate alternative vision in the national debate? And what is the strong and right argument in this debate?
Which of you would like to try that?
Obama for president. Woo!
Of Kenya? I gather he did very well. Juliet, why don't you, but more seriously, why don't you try to respond to that?
I think there is. I think it's very hard politically to say some of the things that have been said here. None of us are running for president, as far as I know, because one, there are a variety of reasons why. One is because the war analogy has had such political consequences, i.e. the 2002 and 2004 elections, and I think that scares a lot of Democrats. But I guess I would take issue with the notion that there isn't an alternative policy of right and clear or whatever. I mean, there are a number, and that seems to me to be right? You can go down the John Kerry route, you can go down the whoever else route, you can, Hillary Clinton route, you can, that they disagree doesn't seem to me to be a crisis about progressive leadership or anything. It's just that, as Tad said, there ain't any good solution. And the stay the course solution is as good or bad as any other. So that's one thing I would say. But I do think that you're starting to see some consensus, at least looking at it from the outside and being involved with something, that everyone is sort of accepting that where we are is that there ought to be changes from where we are, and that the other efforts or other aspects of combating terrorism, such as the law enforcement, intelligence, or whatever else, ought to be as enforced as others. And then finally, the international norms aspect. I mean, I think the torture stuff, the torture debates, I think the Gitmo, I think the military commissions, you don't have to be a raging civil libertarian to just feel uncomfortable about them in really intrinsic ways. And I think that has had, there's very few people, no one will say, I want to torture, but I think that there has been a shift about the aggressiveness of the war on terror. That is going to get played out legislatively and then eventually politically.
It's also worth noticing it's not a partisan issue. Some of the real leadership on this issue has come from Lindsey Graham, a Republican senator, as well as from John McCain, a Republican senator. So it's not a purely partisan
Can I just add one? Sorry.
Sam.
Yeah, no, just from having come from Washington and having gone down with that frustration, you know, and thinking, God, you know, we just got to get out on these issues. Juliet alluded to this, but when you start to pull together the components of a tough, smart, and humane foreign policy, you get about 4 or 5 words in, and then you're cut off, and the question is, well, yeah, so how are we getting out of Iraq? So what are you going to do about Iraq? Is it, well, okay, we'll come to Iraq in a second, but we just want to talk about Iran, and we're talking about UN reform, we want to talk, but how are we getting out of Iraq? That's one point. And then second, briefly, and this is perhaps my greatest impression from being around Capitol Hill, is the degree to which weakness begets weakness. The degree to which you're out of power, you don't control any of the committees, you don't control the gavel. They can literally turn down the volume on you while you're speaking. And so even in the rare moment where you get to incorporate your position on Iraq into a larger framework on national security and how to participate in the struggle against terrorists.
It's good.
It rolls off the tongue. Even as you do that, you're doing it in op-eds, and you're doing it in speeches at the Center for American Progress. You know, it's very different from doing it in a position of power, you know, where you can subpoena witnesses, where you can call your own hearings. It's amazing the degree to which the Democrats' voice is muted by the very weakness we all know to be just a feature of their legislative tally.
Kishore, let's hear it from the other side of the ocean.
Exactly, and this is an extraordinary, this is the key question that we have been pulling our hair out over in the last 5 years. I think one of the fundamental things about that kind of attitude that strong and wrong is fine as long as it's strong, the fundamental weakness of that is that it seems to see foreign policy as something you do, whereas foreign policy is about the relationships with others. And multilateralism is an absolutely essential component. We have no historical record of any country ever having succeeded unilaterally in the long term. It always had to come back to talking to its enemies, to sitting down at the table, to achieving all of that. And what this kind of approach towards foreign policy is doing, that it is not just alienating potential friends of America, it is alienating existing friends of America, and it is leading to people like me who have traditionally been what we describe in the UK as Atlanticist. It is making me terribly enthusiastic about forging a new European foreign policy, because we don't want a unipolar, and you know, European foreign policy is a long way to go yet, but there are 450 million people thereabouts. It's not a peripheral issue entirely, and looking in the long term, depending on how long America decides to go down this route, we need to get our act together.
I will interject an anecdote. I got a call from the BBC this morning that said that Douglas Haig, who's the conservative spokesman on foreign policy, had just given a speech about the importance, William Hague, had just given a speech about the importance of soft power. I said, well, that's interesting. And somebody asked, well, why don't the Americans talk about it? And a friend of mine in Congress said, because it's a political loser. You may be absolutely right, but you can't say it. So there's something about our discourse which is truncated a whole important part of this struggle. But that's another question. Yes?
Hi, my name is Kate Ty. I work here at the Kennedy School. And I am wondering if our foreign policy is dictated by actions and words of our domestic politicians, and that is dictated by the hearts and minds of swing state voters. Whose responsibility is it to change the hearts and minds of swing state voters, and where is an anti-war movement? Why isn't there a cohesive one?
Well, now, who mentioned the swing state voters? Was it Samantha? So
Big mouth here.
Yeah. Illinois is a swing state?
Dean Elwood has heard me say this just this week, so I apologize for repeating myself. Look what Joe did with soft power. If you repeat yourself enough, you create a movement, you know, globally. So I'm going to repeat myself, but I've been reading a lot about the Marshall Plan the last few weeks, and never knew this aspect of the Marshall Plan. You know, we talk about it as why isn't there a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan? Why isn't there a Marshall Plan for Africa? And then we wouldn't maybe have these conflicts longer term. And then you hear the response, of course, sinkholes and all of that. And in looking back at the Marshall Plan, turns out the Marshall Plan was very, very controversial in its day as well, as some of you may know. There was a Republican Congress. They had tried to invest money into European societies in the interwar period. Sinkholes, turns out. Look at World War II. What good did it do? It was a big waste of cash. And so what happened was a group of individuals who had been serving in the Truman administration or in the Roosevelt administration came together and began enlisting the kind of Bill Gateses of the day, that is people not necessarily in the foundation world, but in the corporate world, the creators in American society, along with the entertainers, incredibly bipartisan, with academics, actually left places like Cambridge and went into the red states. And they organized speaking tours around the country in chambers of commerce, in Mason clubs, at a very, very grassroots level, to sell the idea of this kind of post-war commitment and to invoke, indeed, the lessons of the interwar period as a way of solidifying the base. We're on the coast, we're really having a conversation with ourselves right now. And I think it needs to change. I think all of us can play a role, certainly students, in lieu of giving up on places, in the center of the country, those of you who are American. There's an awful lot of curiosity and hunger out there right now. And you see in the poll data the degree to which the public is having this conversation. They're just not getting much in the way of high-level participation or much in the way of interlocutors. But if we're going to enlist, sacrifice, and figure out this balance between liberty and security over time, there's none of our threats can be handled by government alone, whether oil dependence or the kinds of sacrifices that would be required to stabilizing a place like Afghanistan. This is going to have to be a nationwide effort, and I do think we should be looking more carefully at our history when we have built that consensus.
Balcony.
Hi, good evening. My name is Steve Rubright. I'm a mid-career MPA student, and I'm a veteran of the Iraq War. I just returned from Iraq about five months ago. As a reservist, I worked with a lot of citizen soldiers from all walks of life who left their civilian jobs and went out to Iraq and Afghanistan. And in this war on terror, since it is much of a long war, the National Guard and the reserves are being increasingly relied upon. I'd like to direct this question to you, General, if I may. Where do you see the role of the National Guard and the reserves going as we have to continue to fight this war, but yet, since we don't have a draft, how do citizen soldiers balance that? Do you see that people will be leaving the reserves and the National Guard in droves, or do you think that we'll be able to continue to keep both our active duty and our reserve recruiting at the appropriate levels?
Ted?
Follow-on conversation, obviously, to my response to a previous question on whether the military is broken or not. The closest thing to being broke within the military is the Guard and Reserve forces and the commitment we have made to them over the many, many years that they have been with us. And you hit the nail pretty much on the head in that we are asking so much more than what they had thought they had signed up for. Not that it's illegal in any way, but the fact is that we are seeing an erosion that something needs to be done. If there's something that needs to be done with the military other than this transformation to permit us to do more of the stabilization operations, it's really to take a hard look. Personally, I would like to see the reserve forces take a much larger role in our homeland domestic security that has to do with responding to domestic events, responding to natural events, responding to maybe terrorist acts. Not exclusively, because in order to recruit, we have to make sure that we are providing an opportunity for folks who want to serve in our reserve forces to do the active duty, classic warfighting actions as well. So I think we're on the right track because this is being looked at seriously right now. But if I were to look down the road, I would see a much greater percentage of our reserve forces involved in domestic issues and a less percentage in our overseas. What has to happen, of course, is to figure out a way to be able to reduce the amount of commitment we have in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, because we can't do both with the numbers we have now.
Bell.
Hi, my name is Miriam Chaktai. I'm a graduate student at the School of Education. I'm a first-generation Pakistani American and a Muslim, a moderate Muslim. 5 years ago, right after the attacks, there was a theory in the Muslim world that Al-Qaeda was no doubt a partner in this event, but it was not the only partner and probably not the most important partner in making September 11th happen. I did pay attention to conspiracy theories anyway, but today, 5 years later, it has taken a shape within the US because you are experts of politics and you've seen politics at its worst and best. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the validity of, or the possibility that there might be some truth to it.
Julia, you were on the National Commission on Terrorism.
I think I'm understanding what you're asking, which is the various conspiracy theories that the United States might have known, was involved with. Is that right? Just to
Specifically, that the current administration was a part of September 11th.
That's just bunk. It's easy. There are a few things that are clear. That's one of them. We can debate the politics of it after the fact. You can read Bob Woodward's book. Would we have gone into Iraq anyway? Probably. I think there's probably no question about it. But the notion that there was any sort of specific intent or knowledge, that's enough said. But there's one more thing. The fact that conspiracy theories not only take hold, if you actually look at the Zogby polling about the conspiracy theories, bunk in the moderate area. So if you look at what I think Morocco, Jordan's a moderate Muslim states, Morocco, Jordan, Pakistan, and potentially Egypt. So if you look at some of the Zogby polling, which is very interesting to look at in terms of feelings in the Middle East, the percentage of those populations that believed in the conspiracy theories was quite low on September 11th, what you're talking about. And that has changed over time. And that is, getting to the sort of public diplomacy, how do we engage the world? That's just it's untrue, but that's just a bad trend that we just need to, it's another part of the bigger issue.
But if I could say that I think one of the reasons that perception has changed over time, and that there are more people who now believe in conspiracy theories, particularly in the Muslim world, across the Muslim world, is the litany of deceptions that were fed in democratic countries to the people, the electorate, in order to embark on that venture. So there's been a diminution of trust across Western and Eastern countries. Serving politicians who were implicated in the decisions that were taken from that point onwards are less trusted now than they were then.
This will have to be the last question, but it'll be to the woman here. You might want to bend that mic down.
Thank you. My name is Angela Lagdame. I'm a master's in public policy candidate here. I hope this ends on a positive note. And what I'm wondering is, Professor Powers, you have mentioned that we have engaged in this axis of evil, us versus them rhetoric, and we need to recalibrate our words now as a nation just in order to progress. And I'm wondering, what is that message that we need to carry out, and what is that message that we need as a nation to start engaging in?
But this is probably something that everybody could maybe,
Yeah, why don't we go right down the line quickly?
But when I actually talked about recalibration, I wasn't even referring specifically to the dichotomy, the kind of Manichaean framework that has been imposed upon the world. I was talking more about what the Baroness was just speaking about, which is the degree to which our ability to get what we want. It's like the boy who cried wolf. I often think that it really is the case that everything we need to know about foreign policy we learned in kindergarten. But having cried wolf and having not then reckoned with people in the Islamic world, in the developing world, frankly, in Europe, our ability to extract commitments either to do the noble thing and, let's say, go help people in Darfur, or to do the slightly more self-interested thing, which is to cooperate in intelligence circles, that is undermined. So partly what I would call for is a reckoning. And I think what you would see is that then our words, when uttered over time anyway, would reacquire at least some of the credibility. I mean, in certain circles, they're never going to have any credibility. And then the other thing is that, you know, it's so manifest to people that our investments in democratization, and indeed even to a degree in Africa, just because of the rhetoric that comes out of this country, that it's rooted in a regard for other people insofar as helping them ensures they don't become terrorists who come back and haunt us. It's the sort of instrumentalization of development, of economic development, of human rights promotion, and so on. And that might have worked, and it might have been necessary in a domestic context, certainly, over the course of the, during the Cold War and the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. But when a press conference by the President of the United States or by one of his cabinet officials is broadcast immediately into the Islamic world, that instrumentalization of their fate and their plight is it's ultimately a dangerous thing, because it undermines the sincerity of all our commitments, because it's always about us and never, in fact, about them.
Tad, final word?
Just a quick follow-up, I think. It's the realization that our most powerful product is our democracy. And if there's a way forward, a realization that we need to figure out how to let our message out without forcing it out. And that we need to get away from this idea that we have to back it up with some sense of power or some sense of power play. And that if we can ever let the message get out, we'll be far better off.
Juliet?
I guess I would say that I don't think there ought to be one message. That I think that if you actually looked at a foreign policy, if you even thought about just ourselves, what's going to make us safer, that's the way you wanted to view how to go forward. The message is going to have to be diverse depending on who we're talking to, but we need to talk. And so, for example, our policy on Iran, I mean, yesterday's controversy about who was speaking here. I mean, this is the Kennedy School, no offense. I mean, it's like not, I mean, he's just talking, right? I mean, and, you know, engage a country that clearly can't be ignored anymore, right? And figure out what we're going to say to them. What are the carrots and sticks, right? That will be a different message to Western Europe, and it might be a different message to Latin America, and it will certainly be a different message to whatever happens in Cuba when Castro dies. I don't think there has to be one clear message, but I do think this notion that let me say, it's ahistorical to have a notion that you don't talk to your enemies, right? That's just Russia, Reagan, Nixon, China. I mean, we can do it. And so I guess I'm not sure what the lofty statement is, but I think that if we can just sort of pick up the phone.
Yes, I think that's right. And there's a great danger to see the other as the other. And I think to recognize, perhaps, with an indulgence in finding some empathy, recognize perhaps that there are people in other parts of the world whose values don't always coincide with yours, but they have a right to their values and their opinions, and perhaps it's not entirely necessary to superimpose your values on every corner of the globe, and to accept that occasionally it's time to live and let live. I think it makes for a safer world, and it certainly makes for a more peaceful world.
I will just add that if I were to answer that question, it would be to go back to that issue of what I call jujitsu politics. Not lump the world together, because if you lump your enemies together, they'll be stronger than you. And in that sense, we should recover a phrase that was used by John F. Kennedy, for whom the school is named, which is not to make the world safe for democracy, but to make the world safe for diversity. And perhaps with that message, we can begin to have a better understanding of where we are. 5 years after 9/11, we're still, as a people, feeling our way. It was like a flash of lightning on a summer evening, which illuminates a terrible, steep descent. And now it's gone dark. We're picking our way through it. We've stubbed our toes from time to time, but I think we are making our way. And we've heard some of that on both sides tonight. And I hope that we'll hear some more a bit later when the President's speech is broadcast here. but let me turn it to Dean Elwood to say the final word.
I just, first of all, I want to thank the panel for a really quite illuminating and interesting session. Two other things. I actually really think there's a lot of hope for the future. I think we actually have made a lot of progress. I think we're learning. Of course, I think the analogy of stumbling in the dark at times is appropriate. I think a lot of the hope is in this room. The kinds of people, the kinds of questions, the kinds of opportunities, the willingness to talk about different ideas. And so I am very excited about that. The last thing I just would like to reiterate something that Joe mentioned quickly, but you may not have heard. We will be showing the President's address at 9 o'clock on 9/11, and you're welcome to stay and join us for that. So thank you all for being here on this momentous anniversary, and have a safe journey home. Thank you.